The story of the American Revolution did not begin with a single musket shot, a single protest, or a single law. It began with the long buildup of pressures, economic, political, cultural, and emotional, that developed over decades. By the time fighting erupted at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the revolution was not a sudden event. It was the final outcome of conflicts that had been growing quietly beneath the surface of the British Empire. Long before open tensions appeared, the English colonies in North America had formed their own identity. For more than a century, most colonies governed themselves through local assemblies and town meetings. Britain, separated from its colonies by a vast ocean, generally allowed this self-government to continue with minimal interference. The system, sometimes called salutary neglect, gave colonists an unusual degree of freedom compared to most people living under European empires. Over time, colonists came to see themselves as a people capable of managing their own affairs. They elected their own representatives, created trade networks, founded towns, and settled land on the expanding frontier. Even so, many colonists still believed they were loyal subjects of the British Crown. They read British books, celebrated British traditions, and viewed their rights as part of the long English struggle for liberty that stretched back to Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Yet a quiet transformation was underway. Life in North America was different from life in Britain. The frontier demanded self-reliance. Religious diversity encouraged tolerance and independence of thought. Generations were growing up who had never seen England and felt more connected to Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston than to London. A distinct American identity was emerging, even if few recognized it at the time. The turning point came with the 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War. Britain and France fought for control of the continent, and the colonies played a major role in the conflict. Britain won, but victory brought enormous costs. The first consequence was a massive war debt. Britain's national debt nearly doubled, and Parliament began searching for ways to raise money. To British leaders, it seemed reasonable that the colonists, who had gained security from the war, should help pay for it. The second consequence was the British government's desire for greater control over the colonies. During the war, some colonial assemblies resisted British authority, and smuggling remained widespread. Now that the conflict was over, Britain wanted a more orderly and tightly managed empire. The third major outcome was the decision to leave a standing army in North America. British officials believed this force was necessary to guard the frontier and enforce new policies. But many colonists saw the army as a threat. In their minds, a permanent British military presence in peacetime suggested that the Crown was preparing to coerce, not protect, its own subjects. These differences in perspective, Britain seeking stronger imperial control and the colonies expecting a continuation of their autonomy, set the stage for deeper conflict. After the war, Britain introduced several policies intended to strengthen its authority and raise revenue. The first was the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Britain hoped this would prevent costly conflicts with native nations. Colonists, however, viewed it as a restriction on their freedom and future prosperity. Next came the Sugar Act of 1764, which increased taxes on imported sugar and cracked down on smuggling. This policy hurt merchants, sailors, and dock workers, and sparked early protests. The Currency Act followed, limiting the colonies' ability to print their own paper money. This made economic life more difficult, especially for farmers and small business owners struggling with debt. These acts angered many colonists, but the real crisis emerged with the Stamp Act of 1765. For the first time, Parliament imposed a direct tax on paper goods, like legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. To the colonists, it represented an unprecedented intrusion. They had always paid taxes passed by their own elected assemblies, not taxes imposed from across the ocean. Colonial leaders argued that Parliament had no right to tax people who were not represented in that body. Britain replied that colonists enjoyed something called virtual representation, meaning that Parliament represented all British subjects, even if they had not chosen its members. This explanation convinced few colonists. They believed that if Parliament could impose one tax without their consent, it could impose many more, potentially endangering their property and liberty. Protests erupted throughout the colonies. Merchants agreed to boycott British goods. Groups like the Sons of Liberty organized demonstrations. Some protests turned violent, targeting stamp distributors and officials. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions condemning the tax. Britain eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but the conflict had already changed the relationship between the colonies and the empire. Trust had weakened. Both sides began to view each other with deep suspicion. The stage was now set for larger confrontations. As Britain continued to assert authority and the colonies grew more determined to defend what they believed were their rights, the road toward revolution became increasingly difficult to avoid. After the repeal of the Stamp Act, many colonists celebrated, believing the crisis had passed. But the victory was temporary. In Britain, leaders were unsettled by the level of resistance they had encountered. They feared that if the colonies were not brought firmly under imperial control, they would continue to challenge Parliament's authority. Determined not to lose influence over the growing American population, British officials soon introduced a new series of measures that reignited tensions. In 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. These laws placed taxes on imported goods such as glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Unlike the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties were external taxes placed on trade, not internal taxes on everyday transactions. British leaders believed the colonists would accept this distinction. They were wrong. To many colonists, the issue was no longer simply the form of the tax. The real question was whether Parliament had any right to tax them without their direct consent. Colonial resistance grew again. Newspapers published essays arguing that free people could not be taxed by distant rulers. Merchants renewed their boycotts of British goods. Housewives and families joined the movement by refusing to buy taxed products, making their own clothing, and supporting local crafts. The spirit of protest spread from port cities to small towns and rural communities. British customs officials tried to enforce the Townshend Acts more aggressively, leading to confrontations in major coastal cities. Smugglers were prosecuted, ships were seized, and tensions between colonists and British authorities escalated. In Boston, where resentment was especially strong, conflicts became increasingly personal. British soldiers were eventually stationed in the city to maintain order, a decision that only deepened colonial hostility. The presence of troops in Boston created a charged atmosphere. Soldiers and townspeople often crossed paths in crowded streets and public squares. Verbal insults, small scuffles, and rumors circulated constantly. On March 5, 1770, these tensions exploded in an event that would become known as the Boston Massacre. A group of colonists confronted British soldiers outside the customs house. Snowballs, stones, and insults were exchanged, and amid the confusion, the soldiers opened fire. 5 colonists were killed. News of the incident spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Leaders like Samuel Adams used the event to rally public opinion against British rule. Though the soldiers were later defended in court by John Adams and most were acquitted, the damage to British credibility was severe. Many colonists now viewed the British military as a force of oppression rather than protection. The massacre became a symbol of the dangers posed by standing armies in peacetime and fueled demands for greater colonial autonomy. In response to growing unrest, Britain repealed most of the Townshend duties in 1770, but one tax was left in place, the tax on tea. Keeping the small tax was meant to assert Parliament's right to legislate for the colonies. However, the decision would soon set off one of the most dramatic acts of protest in American history. By 1773, the British East India Company was facing financial trouble. To help the company, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which allowed it to sell tea directly to the colonies at reduced prices, undercutting local merchants. Although the tea was cheaper, the tax remained. Colonial leaders saw the act as a trap, an attempt to persuade colonists to accept Parliament's right to tax them. Many merchants feared they would be driven out of business if the East India Company gained a monopoly. Resistance spread quickly. Ships carrying tea were turned away from several ports. In Boston, however, the royal governor refused to let the ships depart without unloading their cargo. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists disguised themselves and boarded the ships. In a dramatic act of defiance, they dumped more than 300 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This event, remembered as the Boston Tea Party, shocked Britain and thrilled many colonists. British leaders responded with harsh measures meant to punish Massachusetts and reassert authority. These laws, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, closed Boston Harbor until the lost tea was paid for, drastically limited the powers of the Massachusetts government, and allowed royal officials accused of crimes to be tried outside the colony. A new version of the Quartering Act required colonists to house British soldiers when necessary. To many colonists, these actions looked less like justice and more like the deliberate destruction of their constitutional freedoms. Rather than isolate Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts unified the colonies. Leaders in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere recognized that if Britain could crush the liberties of Massachusetts, it could do the same to any colony. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Most delegates were not yet seeking independence, but they agreed that collective action was necessary. They organized a widespread boycott of British goods and declared their support for the people of Massachusetts. Colonial assemblies began training militias and preparing for possible conflict. Pamphlets and speeches emphasized the need to defend traditional rights. Across the colonies, ordinary farmers, artisans, and tradespeople started to see the struggle not just as a political dispute, but as a fight for the preservation of liberty itself. By early 1775, the situation had reached a breaking point. British officials feared rebellion and sought to seize colonial weapons stored in Massachusetts. Colonists believed Britain was preparing to disarm them by force. The two sides were on a direct collision course. Neither fully realized how close they were to open war. Tensions that had been building for years were about to ignite. The long chain of misunderstandings, economic pressures, political arguments, and cultural changes had brought the British Empire and the 13 colonies to the edge of conflict. The next steps would not be disputes in Parliament or protests in city streets. They would be battles in the fields of New England. By the spring of 1775, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies was strained beyond repair. Years of disagreement had hardened attitudes on both sides. British officials believed they were dealing with a rebellion that threatened the unity and authority of the empire. Many colonists believed they were defending their fundamental rights as Englishmen. Both sides assumed they were acting reasonably. Both sides believed the other was overreacting. The space for compromise had nearly disappeared. In Massachusetts, tensions were especially high. The colony had become the center of resistance, and British troops in Boston had been instructed to keep order. Colonial leaders had been meeting in secret, training local militias known as Minutemen. These citizen soldiers agreed to be ready for action at a moment's notice. British authorities viewed them as dangerous insurgents. Meanwhile, colonists saw the troops in Boston as a standing army deployed against its own people. General Thomas Gage, the British commander, received orders to seize colonial military supplies secretly stored in Concord. The mission was meant to prevent violence by disarming the colonies, but the plan had the opposite effect. On the night of April 18, 1775, British troops marched out of Boston toward Concord. Riders such as Paul Revere and William Dawes sounded the alarm across the countryside. Church bells rang, lanterns were lit, militiamen mobilized. The next morning, British soldiers met a small group of colonial militia on the village green in Lexington. The two sides faced each other in a tense standoff. A shot rang out. No one knew who fired first. The skirmish ended quickly, with several colonists dead. The British troops continued to Concord, where they found fewer supplies than expected. As they marched back toward Boston, thousands of militiamen attacked them from behind stone walls and wooded hillsides. The running battle left many casualties and shocked British commanders who had underestimated colonial determination. The fighting at Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of open warfare. The news spread rapidly, reunifying the colonies. People who had previously doubted the possibility of conflict now saw that the struggle had begun. Moderate leaders who had hoped for peaceful solutions found themselves pushed toward resistance. Militias from across New England converged on Boston, surrounding the British forces and beginning a siege that would last for months. Although war had begun, most colonists did not immediately call for independence. Many still considered themselves loyal subjects of the king and hoped that he might intervene to restore their rights. They believed Parliament was to blame, not the monarchy. In July 1775, the Second Continental Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III, asking for reconciliation. At the same time, however, Congress also approved the creation of a Continental Army and appointed George Washington as its commander. The colonies were attempting diplomacy and military preparedness simultaneously, uncertain of what path lay ahead. King George rejected the Olive Branch petition and declared the colonies to be in rebellion. His refusal convinced many Americans that peaceful compromise was no longer possible. The British government began assembling large military forces and hired thousands of German soldiers to help fight. These actions reinforced colonial fears that Britain intended not to negotiate, but to crush opposition by force. While political leaders debated their next steps, ideas were shifting among ordinary people. New pamphlets and essays circulated widely. The most influential was Common Sense, published by Thomas Paine in early 1776. Paine argued that the colonies owed no loyalty to a distant island and that monarchy itself was an unjust and outdated institution. His writing was clear, powerful, and accessible. It inspired thousands to reconsider their views and helped move public opinion toward independence. Economic pressures also played a role in the growing push for independence. Colonial trade had been disrupted by the conflict, and British naval blockades affected merchants and farmers alike. Many began to question whether they would ever control their own economic future while remaining part of the empire. The idea of independence became not only a political argument, but also a practical solution. In addition to political and economic motivations, cultural changes influenced the movement. Many colonists came to see themselves as part of a united cause. Men and women from different colonies exchanged letters, raised funds, and supported each other. Groups once separated by geography began to recognize their shared struggles. This new sense of American identity made independence seem both natural and inevitable. By the middle of 1776, momentum had shifted decisively. The Continental Congress debated the issue of independence openly. Delegates waived the risks. Standing up to the most powerful empire in the world was dangerous, and failure could mean execution for treason. But the alternative, returning to a system in which their rights could be removed without consent, seemed equally unacceptable. On July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4th, it approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence. The document explained the colony's reasons for breaking away, accusing the British government of violating the natural rights of the American people. It declared that governments exist to secure these rights and that the people have the authority to change governments that fail to protect them. The decision transformed the conflict. What had begun as a struggle for rights within the British Empire had become a full fight for national independence. The colonies now called themselves the United States of America. The war would continue for several more years, but the deeper reasons for the revolution, economic frustration, political conflict, cultural identity, and the belief in self-government, had already shaped the course of history. The events leading up to the revolution reveal that the conflict was not caused by a single act or moment. It was the result of long-standing tensions, misunderstandings, and clashing visions. Britain believed it was strengthening and protecting its empire. The colonists believed they were defending freedoms that had been theirs for generations. Over time, the gap between these beliefs became too wide to bridge. The revolution did not begin simply with the firing of muskets. It began in the minds of people who felt their rights, prosperity, and identity were at stake. To understand the deeper reasons the American Revolution began, it is important to look beyond the political events and battlefield moments. The revolution was not simply a reaction to taxes, soldiers, or parliamentary laws. It was the product of long-term social, cultural, economic, and ideological forces that shaped the colonies for generations. These forces created a world in which independence gradually became both possible and necessary in the minds of many colonists. One of the most important foundations of the revolution was the long tradition of self-government in the colonies. For more than a century, local assemblies, town meetings, and elected councils had handled most internal affairs. Colonists chose tax rates, managed courts, regulated trade within their borders, and controlled local militias. This long experience convinced many Americans that they were fully capable of governing themselves. When Britain attempted to reassert imperial control after the 7 Years' War, colonists were not rebelling against an unfamiliar restriction. They were defending a system of freedom they had practiced for generations. Another major factor was the economic environment of the colonies. For many decades, colonial trade operated under a system that benefited both the colonies and the empire. The Navigation Acts regulated commerce, but they were not always strictly enforced. Colonists had grown accustomed to trading widely with the Caribbean, Europe, and even rival empires when it suited their needs. After the war, Britain tightened enforcement of these rules. Many merchants saw this as a threat not only to their profits, but to the open economic system they had come to rely on. Economic independence began to feel as important as political independence. The frontier also shaped the colonists' attitudes. Life on the edge of settled territory demanded self-reliance, cooperation, and resilience. Families often moved west to claim land and build communities with little help from the government. This frontier spirit fostered a sense of independence and personal liberty. When Britain attempted to restrict westward expansion with the Proclamation of 1763, many colonists viewed the policy as a direct challenge to their way of life. To them, the right to move, farm, and settle freely was essential. Cultural diversity in the colonies also contributed to revolutionary thinking. The population included English, Scots-Irish, Germans, Africans, Dutch, French Huguenots, and many others. These groups brought different traditions, beliefs, and experiences. They did not share a single united identity at first, but the mixture created a society far more fluid and flexible than Europe. People changed religious affiliations, moved between colonies, and built communities based on shared values rather than strict social classes. This environment made new ideas easier to spread and encouraged the belief that society could evolve and improve. Religion played a significant role as well. The Great Awakening, a major religious revival in the mid 18th century, encouraged individuals to question authority and seek personal understanding. Ministers such as George Whitefield preached that all people were equal in the eyes of God. These messages inspired many to believe that no earthly institution, including monarchy, should have unchecked power. The same spirit that led people to challenge religious authority eventually inspired them to question political authority too. Another crucial influence was the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke, Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that governments exist to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. These ideas spread throughout the colonies through books, pamphlets, lectures, and conversations. Many colonial leaders, including Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, were deeply influenced by Enlightenment thought. They believed that legitimate government required the consent of the governed. When Britain acted in ways that appeared arbitrary or coercive, colonists increasingly viewed those actions as violations of natural law. The spread of literacy and print culture helped popularize these ideas. By the mid 1700s, the colonies had high literacy rates compared to Europe. Newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides circulated widely. A single essay or speech could reach thousands of readers in a matter of weeks. This communication network unified the colonies and helped people understand that their grievances were shared. When events such as the Stamp Act or the Boston Massacre occurred, descriptions and interpretations spread rapidly, shaping public opinion across distant regions. Community organizations also played a role in building revolutionary sentiment. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty organized protests, coordinated boycotts, and kept people informed. Committees of correspondence linked communities and colonies together, allowing leaders to exchange information and build alliances. These networks created a sense of unity and purpose that did not exist before. They enabled ordinary citizens to participate in political action directly, giving them a stake in the struggle. Another underlying cause of the revolution was the growing tension between colonial expectations and British reality. Colonists believed they were defending their established rights. British leaders believed they were restoring proper imperial authority. These conflicting viewpoints made compromise increasingly difficult. Every new law or protest deepened the misunderstanding. The more Britain tried to tighten control, the more the colonies felt their liberties were at threat. The more the colonists resisted, the more Britain believed its authority was being challenged. The social structure of the colonies also made revolution more likely. Unlike Europe, where class divisions were rigid, the colonies had a comparatively open society. Wealth and status could be gained through trade, skill, and frontier opportunity. This openness gave many colonists a sense of equality and personal worth. When Britain attempted to assert imperial hierarchy, many Americans rejected the idea that they were subjects with fewer rights than people living in Britain. They believed distance did not diminish their entitlement to liberty. Ultimately, the revolution was driven by the belief that the colonies could build a better society. People imagined a land governed by their own representatives, free from distant rulers. They envisioned a system where laws were made close to home and where economic opportunity was not limited by imperial regulation. This vision of a new political and social order gave the movement its strength. It inspired people to risk their livelihoods, their safety, and even their lives. By the time shots were fired in 1775, these deeper forces had already transformed the colonies. Political disagreements had turned into ideological divisions. Local protests had become a coordinated movement. The desire to protect rights had expanded into the desire to control their own destiny. The revolution erupted not because one tax was too high or one law was too restrictive, but because a new American identity had emerged, one that no longer fit comfortably within the British Empire. As the revolution approached, the colonies were not only shaped by ideas and politics, but also by the everyday experiences of ordinary people. These experiences of farmers, artisans, merchants, enslaved people, native nations, and frontier families played a quiet but significant role in pushing America toward independence. Understanding these perspectives reveals how deeply rooted the revolution truly was. For many farmers and rural families, the conflict was intertwined with the challenge of economic survival. Farming in the colonies was unpredictable. Weather, soil conditions, and market fluctuations shaped daily life. When new British policies restricted trade, tightened credit, or disrupted local economies, rural families felt the impact immediately. Higher taxes on imported goods made tools and supplies more expensive. Hard currency shortages made it difficult to pay debts. British enforcement of trade laws limited the markets where farmers could sell their products. These economic frustrations reinforced the belief that decisions affecting colonial life were being made by people thousands of miles away who did not understand local needs. To many colonists, these distant rulers seemed unconcerned about the hardships imposed by their policies. This sense of disconnect gradually transformed economic inconvenience into political resentment. Artisans and tradespeople in cities such as Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston were also deeply affected. Blacksmiths, carpenters, printers, and shipbuilders relied on the steady flow of materials and customers. When British acts disrupted trade, urban workers often lost income. They joined boycotts because they believed economic pressure was one of the few tools they had to influence imperial policy. When protest intensified, these same workers became some of the most active participants in street demonstrations, public meetings, and resistance groups. Merchants, meanwhile, had their own motivations. Many had built their success on the flexibility of colonial trade networks. They resented British attempts to control who they could sell to, what goods they could import, and how they could conduct business. Smuggling had become a widespread and accepted part of economic life. When Britain cracked down on illicit trade, merchants saw it as an attempt to restrict their independence and profits. Their influence helped spread resistance throughout the colony's commercial centers. For enslaved Africans and African Americans, the revolution presented a different set of choices and challenges. Many enslaved people saw the conflict as an opportunity to seek freedom. Some were inspired by the colonists' arguments about liberty and natural rights. Others were drawn by the promises made by British officials, who offered freedom to enslaved people willing to escape and support the British cause. This created deep divisions within colonial society. Slaveholders feared that the turmoil of war might inspire large-scale uprisings. These fears led many colonial elites to push even harder for control over their own political systems and to reject British interference altogether. Native nations were also central to the conflict's deeper causes. For generations, Native American communities had negotiated with European powers while trying to protect their land and autonomy. The Proclamation of 1763, which restricted colonial settlement west of the Appalachians, was partly intended to prevent conflicts with Native nations. Colonists, however, viewed the restriction as unfair and ignored it whenever possible. As settlers continued to push westward, tensions grew. The British attempt to control frontier expansion convinced many colonists that the empire was preventing them from claiming land they believed they were entitled to. The desire for Western land made imperial rule seem increasingly burdensome. Family life in the colonies also played a subtle role in shaping revolutionary sentiment. Many families had lived in America for multiple generations. Children and grandchildren grew up with memories, stories, and traditions rooted not in England, but in the communities where they were born. Their sense of identity was shaped by local customs, regional pride, and the landscapes they inhabited. These emotional connections to America rather than to Britain created a cultural foundation for independence long before it became a political goal. Another factor that encouraged revolutionary feeling was the rapid growth of the colonial population. By the mid 1700s, the colonies had millions of inhabitants. Many began to wonder why such a large and thriving society remained under the distant control of a small island across the ocean. The scale of the colonial population made some leaders believe that America was already strong enough to govern itself. They saw no reason to accept political decisions made by a government that did not directly represent them. The rise of intercolonial cooperation further strengthened the movement. Events such as the Stamp Act protests, the Boston Tea Party, and the First Continental Congress brought people from different colonies together. Previously, colonies had often acted independently and viewed one another as rivals. New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies each had their own cultures and priorities, but common grievances encouraged unity. Shared experiences built trust. Suddenly, people who had once rarely interacted found themselves part of a larger struggle. This new sense of collective identity laid the groundwork for a national movement. The British government failed to recognize how deeply colonial society had changed. Officials believed the colonies were still dependent, scattered, and loyal. They underestimated the economic strength, political experience, and cultural confidence of the colonial population. Each new law, tax, or enforcement action widened the gap between imperial intention and colonial interpretation. What Britain saw as reasonable governance, colonists increasingly saw as intrusive domination. By the early 1720s, the colonies had become a complex, confident, and interconnected society. They had their own political institutions, their own economic networks, their own cultural traditions, and their own shared sense of possibility. Britain's attempts to tighten control clashed with this growing American identity. The resulting tensions pushed ordinary people, farmers, artisans, merchants, and families toward the belief that independence might offer a better future. The revolution began not only in the halls of Congress or on village greens, but in the hearts and minds of everyday colonists. Their experiences, frustrations, hopes, and choices all contributed to the growing conviction that the colonies no longer belonged within the British Empire. The movement toward independence was the result of countless individual decisions shaped by the realities of colonial life. As resistance to British authority grew stronger in the early 1770s, the colonies entered a period of mounting tension, uncertainty, and transformation. The relationship between Britain and the colonies had become strained to the breaking point. Yet the true causes of the revolution were not found only in taxes and policies, but in how the colonists interpreted these events and how their political consciousness evolved. During this time, public opinion played an increasingly powerful role. Newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, and tavern conversations shaped how people understood political events. The spread of ideas was faster than ever before, thanks to a booming colonial printing industry. Printers published essays, letters, and speeches that questioned British motives and highlighted colonial grievances. Readers shared these writings with neighbors and families, discussing them in homes, shops, churches, and meeting houses. This open exchange of ideas helped ordinary people form opinions about issues that once seemed distant or abstract. Politics became a public conversation rather than an elite debate. Colonists who had never spoken about imperial policy now found themselves arguing about representation, justice, and liberty. This rise in political engagement marked a turning point. The revolution was becoming not just a dispute between leaders, but a movement grounded in everyday life. A significant theme in these discussions was the fear of losing long established rights. Many colonists believed their rights as English subjects were under threat. The rights to petition, to assemble peacefully, to be tried by a jury, and to have property protected by law were deeply valued. Colonial charters guaranteed certain freedoms, and for generations, the colonies had governed themselves with minimal interference. When Britain began asserting greater authority, colonists saw it not as a simple adjustment, but as an erosion of rights they had long considered theirs. Religious influences also played an important role. The Great Awakening, earlier in the century, had encouraged people to question traditional authority, think independently, and rely on personal judgment. These attitudes carried over into political life. Ministers in many churches, particularly Congregational, Presbyterian, and Baptist congregations, spoke openly about tyranny, moral duty, and the need to resist injustice. Their sermons framed the political conflict in moral terms, describing liberty as a God given responsibility. For many colonists, the struggle against British control became not just political, but spiritual. Another key factor was a sense of geographic and emotional distance between America and Britain. Life in the colonies was different from life in England. The forests, rivers, mountains, and open spaces of North America shaped a unique way of thinking. Colonists were used to making decisions for themselves, whether settling frontier land, forming local committees, or building new towns. Survival in the New World required cooperation, adaptability, and independence. Over time, these qualities became part of colonial identity. Many Americans felt that people living thousands of miles away, people who had never seen colonial life, could not fairly or effectively govern them. Economic pressures continued to intensify frustrations. Rising prices, trade restrictions, and periodic shortages made everyday life difficult. The colonies relied on a system of credit, borrowing, and exchange. When British policies disrupted this system, merchants and farmers faced real financial hardship. This was not simply about taxes. It was about the ability to earn a living, support a family, and maintain economic stability. The sense that British decisions were undermining local prosperity helped push many undecided colonists toward resistance. Equally important was the rise of organizations dedicated to resisting British authority. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty spread across colonial towns, organizing protests, coordinating boycotts, and communicating with one another. These groups helped unify colonial action. Instead of isolated local protests, resistance became coordinated and deliberate. Committees of correspondence linked communities from New Hampshire to Georgia, ensuring that news traveled quickly and that colonies understood one another's experiences. Through these networks, colonists built a shared narrative, the belief that Britain's actions were part of a deliberate plan to reduce the colonies to subservience. Whether or not British leaders intended it, this interpretation gained traction. Each new policy was viewed as further evidence of this supposed plan. Trust faded rapidly. Suspicion grew. Colonists increasingly believed that only vigilance and strong action could preserve their rights. Social divisions added another layer of complexity. Not all colonists agreed with the growing resistance movement. Loyalists, who remained supportive of the British Crown, worried that protests were becoming too radical. Some feared economic collapse, Others valued stability and believed that rebellion was dangerous and unnecessary. Yet, local patriots often portrayed loyalists as enemies of liberty. This tension created social pressures that pushed many hesitant colonists to choose a side. At the same time, the cracks within colonial society revealed deeper issues. Enslaved people saw the conflict as an opportunity for freedom, even as slaveholders spoke about liberty. Poor laborers and tenant farmers questioned whether independence would improve their lives or simply maintain old hierarchies. Women who lacked political rights nonetheless played crucial roles, organizing boycotts, producing homemade goods, managing farms and businesses, and spreading information within local communities. These varied experiences helped shape the broader movement. The revolution was not driven by a single group or idea. It was the result of interactions between different classes, regions, and perspectives. The shared sense that something fundamental was changing unified people who otherwise held very different priorities. By the mid 1770s, the colonial mindset had shifted dramatically. What had begun as frustration over British policy had become a far deeper belief, the belief that America's future could no longer be tied to the decisions of a distant government. Colonists were no longer simply defending rights, they were beginning to imagine the possibility of a different kind of society, one built on local decision making, representation, and liberty. This change in imagination was one of the most important but least visible causes of the American Revolution. Before independence could become a political reality, it had to become a mental possibility. By 1775, that possibility had taken root. By the time the 1770s arrived, the political climate in the American colonies had transformed dramatically. What had once been scattered moments of dissatisfaction had become a widespread movement defined by anger, fear, hope, and a growing belief in self-government. But before open conflict began, the colonies went through a crucial period of political experimentation that helped prepare them for independence. One of the most important developments was the growth of local political bodies that operated independently from royal authority. Town meetings, colonial assemblies, and informal committees had existed for decades, but they now took on new significance. These groups became centers of resistance, places where citizens gathered to debate British policies, vote on local responses, and organize collective action. In New England, town meetings became especially influential. These gatherings were open to many members of the community, allowing ordinary people to voice opinions and vote on public matters. As British regulations tightened, these meetings became increasingly defiant. They passed resolutions protesting imperial actions, approved boycotts of British goods, and encouraged other towns to do the same. This level of political participation strengthened the belief that effective government came from the people themselves, not from distant officials. In larger colonial cities, committees of correspondence played a similar role. These committees acted like early communication networks, sharing news, coordinating protests, and building unity across the colonies. They were some of the first organizations to think in truly continental terms, not as separate colonies, but as a shared community with common interests. This sense of unity was essential in preparing the colonies for collaboration during the Revolution. Another important shift occurred in the colonies' understanding of British intentions. By this time, many colonists believed that the British government was not simply making mistakes, but was actively trying to reduce the colony's autonomy. Events such as the closing of Boston Harbor, the dissolution of colonial legislatures, and the stationing of British troops on American soil confirmed the fear that Britain was willing to use force to impose its authority. Even colonists who had once urged caution began to see resistance as necessary for preserving their rights. These developments created a political atmosphere in which compromise became increasingly difficult. Britain insisted that Parliament had the right to govern the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Colonists argued that Parliament had no right to tax or control them without representation. These opposing views left no room for middle ground. Each new dispute widened the gulf between the two sides, leaving both unwilling to back down. At the same time, colonial leaders began to imagine new political possibilities. Figures such as Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, John Dickinson, and Benjamin Franklin wrote essays and delivered speeches that pushed colonists to think beyond protest. They raised questions about the nature of government itself. What was the purpose of government? Where did political authority come from? Could a people create a government that served their interests rather than the interests of a distant empire? These questions encouraged a deeper exploration of political philosophy. Colonists drew on Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and Montesquieu. They discussed natural rights, social contracts, and the idea that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. These ideas helped frame the conflict as more than a dispute over taxes. They made it a struggle over fundamental principles of human liberty. The First Continental Congress in 1774 marked another step toward unity. Delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia to respond to the intolerable acts. They debated whether to seek reconciliation or prepare for conflict. What emerged was a unified agreement to resist British policies through economic pressure and organized cooperation. While the Congress did not yet call for independence, it demonstrated that the colonies could act together, speak together, and plan together. The formation of the Continental Association, an organized boycott of British goods, showed the growing strength of colonial unity. Local committees enforced the boycott, monitored compliance, and encouraged citizens to participate. These committees functioned almost like a shadow government. In many towns, people looked to them rather than to royal officials for leadership. This shift in authority was one of the clearest signs that the colonies were moving toward independence, even before they declared it. Meanwhile, tensions on the ground were escalating. In Boston and other port cities, British troops were increasingly seen as symbols of foreign oppression. Conflicts between soldiers and civilians grew more frequent. Smugglers clashed with customs officers, demonstrations became bolder. British attempts to assert control only strengthened resistance. On the frontier, frustrations were rising for different reasons. Settlers felt that British policies restricted their opportunities to move west and claim new land. They believed the empire placed too much value on maintaining peace with native nations and not enough on supporting colonial expansion. These frustrations reinforced the belief that British rule did not align with American ambitions. By 1775, conditions were reaching a breaking point. The colonies had developed their own political networks, their own sense of identity, and their own vision of fair government. They had begun to see themselves not as subjects of an empire, but as a people capable of self-rule. The question was no longer whether conflict would occur, but when. As the colonies edged closer to open conflict, one of the most important forces shaping the final break with Britain was fear. Fear of losing liberty, fear of losing property, and fear of living under a government that no longer respected colonial rights. While hope and idealism played crucial roles, it was fear that gave urgency to the growing movement. Many colonists believed that Britain was attempting to fundamentally change the nature of colonial life. They interpreted British actions not as isolated decisions, but as steps in a larger pattern. The pattern, in their view, seemed designed to reduce the colonies to dependence. Each new law, tax, court ruling, or military deployment was seen as confirmation of this belief. These suspicions were fueled by newspapers and pamphlets that analyzed British politics and warned of corruption spreading through the empire. This fear was magnified by events within Britain itself. The British government in the mid-1700s faced significant internal problems: debt, political factionalism, and growing influence from wealthy elites. Many colonists believed these internal pressures made British leaders more willing to exploit the colonies for revenue and control. They worried that the colonies might become victims of political struggles occurring far across the ocean. Fear was also rooted in the presence of standing armies. A standing army, kept in peacetime, was seen by many colonists as a threat to liberty. In their view, free people should not be governed by force. British troops stationed in Boston and other cities created tension that could not be easily resolved. Soldiers patrolled streets, guarded officials, and enforced policies that colonists believed to be unjust. The memory of earlier conflicts, such as the Boston Massacre, intensified public anxiety. Colonists feared that the military would be used to silence dissent and impose obedience. Economic fears grew as well. Many families depended on trade, agriculture, and small businesses to survive. Every time Britain restricted trade or enforced new regulations, colonists worried about losing their livelihoods. Merchants feared bankruptcy, farmers feared access to markets, workers feared unemployment. These everyday concerns added weight to political grievances, turning abstract ideas into urgent personal worries. In addition to economic concerns, many colonists feared the erosion of local authority. For generations, local assemblies and town meetings had shaped colonial life. These institutions allowed citizens to vote on issues such as taxes, schools, roads, and public safety. When Britain dissolved assemblies or overruled local decisions, colonists saw it as an attack on their ability to govern themselves. They worried that if Britain continued down this path, local autonomy would vanish entirely. This fear was sharpened by the memory of earlier historical examples. Colonists were familiar with European history, including the rise of tyrannical monarchs who suppressed local rights. Many believed they could see similar patterns in British behavior. Enlightenment writers had warned that liberty was fragile and that governments often drifted toward corruption if not held in check. These ideas shaped the colonial belief that vigilance was essential. Another important source of fear came from events on the frontier. Colonists living near the edges of settlement faced constant tension with native nations who sought to protect their lands from encroachment. British officials tried to regulate westward expansion to prevent conflict, most notably through the Proclamation of 1763. But frontier settlers saw these restrictions as proof that Britain valued imperial stability over colonial opportunity. They feared that their hopes for land ownership and economic advancement were being blocked by imperial decisions made far away. This frontier frustration was especially strong in places like Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas, where large numbers of settlers hoped to secure new land for themselves and their families. For these colonists, British policy seemed to favor distant interests over their own aspirations. As tensions rose, many frontier communities began to support the patriot cause, not out of ideological conviction, but because they believed independence offered the best chance to control their own destiny. Fears of inequality also played a role. Many colonists believed that British society was becoming increasingly rigid and dominated by powerful elites. They saw America as more open and flexible, a place where hard work could lead to opportunity. If the colonies remained under British growing influence, they worried that American society might adopt the same rigid class structure. Independence became a way to protect the social mobility that many colonists valued. Religious concerns also contributed to the atmosphere of fear. Some colonists, especially in New England, worried that Britain might try to establish the Anglican Church as the dominant or official religion in the colonies. They feared this would limit religious freedom and impose taxes for church support. These fears were amplified by sermons warning that liberty, both civil and spiritual, was under threat. All of these fears, though varied, shared a common thread: the belief that British power was expanding in ways that endangered the rights and future of the colonies. As fear spread, so did solidarity. People who once disagreed on politics began to unite around the idea that the colonies must act together or risk losing everything they valued. This unity was strengthened by the belief that the crisis was not temporary. Colonists increasingly felt that the empire was moving in a direction that could not be reversed. They worried that if they accepted British authority now, future generations would face even harsher conditions. This long-term perspective made compromise less appealing and resistance more urgent. By the time 1775 arrived, fear had become a powerful motivator. It helped turn hesitation into determination, disagreement into cooperation, and frustration into defiance. Colonists were now convinced that inaction was more dangerous than rebellion. The fear of losing liberty was ultimately stronger than the fear of challenging the world's most powerful empire.
The stage was set for the final break. Minds had changed, alliances had formed, and resistance had transformed into resolve. When conflict finally erupted at Lexington and Concord, the colonists did not see it as a sudden outbreak of violence. They saw it as the moment when long-gathering fears reached their inevitable conclusion.
By 1775, the colonies were no longer a collection of separate communities under distant imperial authority. They had begun to think and act collectively, forming networks of communication, coordination, and shared purpose. This growing sense of a united identity was critical in pushing the colonies toward independence. People realized that their fates were intertwined and that no single colony could confront British power alone. The committees of correspondence were a key factor in this emerging unity. They allowed towns and colonies to share news, coordinate boycotts, and mobilize citizens for collective action. When Boston faced the closure of its port, letters from Massachusetts traveled rapidly to other colonies, eliciting sympathy, solidarity, and support. These committees helped ordinary colonists understand that their grievances were not isolated, they were shared across a continent. This reinforced the idea that resistance was not only justified, but necessary. The growth of print culture also helped spread revolutionary ideas. Pamphlets, newspapers, and essays circulated widely, reaching even small towns and frontier communities. Political writers framed issues in terms that resonated with everyday life. They explained taxes, legal restrictions, and military occupation in ways that ordinary people could understand. This accessibility transformed abstract policy debates into personal concerns about liberty, property, and self-determination. Colonists began to see themselves as active participants in shaping their own destiny, rather than passive subjects of imperial rule. Economic factors continue to drive dissatisfaction. Trade restrictions, enforcement of the Navigation Acts, and disruptions caused by British taxation threatened livelihoods. Merchants feared losing profits, artisans worried about access to raw materials, and farmers struggled to sell their crops under restrictive regulations. Economic pressure heightened the sense that British authority was not protecting the colonies, but undermining them. As these grievances multiplied, resistance became both a moral and practical imperative. Cultural identity played a subtler but equally important role. Many colonists had never seen England, and those who had were often surprised by how little their lived experience in the colonies resembled life in the mother country. They were shaped by frontier hardships, self-reliance, and local governance. Religion, too, reinforced independence of thought. The Great Awakening had encouraged colonists to question authority, assert personal judgment, and seek moral as well as political responsibility. These ideas prepared the ground for a revolutionary mindset in which challenging distant rulers was not only acceptable, but necessary. Fear remained a persistent motivator. Colonists feared the permanent imposition of British authority, the loss of local government, the restriction of economic opportunity, and the undermining of long-standing rights. Each new law or military action reinforced these fears. By the time British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord, many colonists believed that liberty itself was at stake. Resistance was no longer a question of principle alone. It was a matter of survival and self-preservation. The formation of militias and the preparation for armed defense reflected this urgency. Communities trained local men to respond quickly to threats. Ordinary citizens, farmers, tradesmen, and laborers became soldiers overnight. This widespread participation demonstrated the depth of commitment to defending what colonists saw as their inherent rights. It also signaled to Britain that opposition was not limited to a few vocal leaders, but was rooted in the broader population. The ideological groundwork had been laid over decades. Political theorists in the colonies, influenced by Enlightenment ideas, emphasized natural rights, consent of the governed, and limitations on the power of rulers. Leaders such as Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Samuel Adams combined these philosophical principles with practical political action, inspiring colonists to see the conflict in moral as well as political terms. They framed resistance not merely as defiance, but as a duty to protect fundamental liberties. By early 1775, both leaders and ordinary people understood that the dispute was no longer a temporary disagreement, but a fundamental challenge to the structure of authority itself. The colonies had created parallel institutions,
coordinated communication networks, and local enforcement mechanisms. They were ready to operate independently if necessary. British miscalculations, such as underestimating colonial unity and resolve, accelerated the push toward armed conflict. The outbreak of hostilities at Lexington and Concord marked the culmination of these long developing causes. It was the spark that ignited tensions that had been simmering for decades. When colonists took up arms, they were not reacting spontaneously. They were acting on years of preparation, shared experience, and collective belief in the right to self governance. This pattern would continue throughout the Revolutionary War. Battles, negotiations, and campaigns were intertwined with political organization, ideological commitment, and social transformation. The revolution was not simply a military struggle, it was a comprehensive societal shift. Ordinary people became politically active, communities united in purpose, and a new national identity began to emerge. By understanding these deeper causes, economic pressures, cultural identity, ideological development, and fear of losing rights, it becomes clear that the American Revolution was far more than a reaction to taxes or laws. It was the inevitable outcome of decades of change, tension, and preparation. The colonies were not just fighting for redress of grievances, they were fighting for the ability to define their own political, social, and economic future. The period leading up to the Revolution was also marked by the evolution of American leadership. Colonial leaders were not simply rebellious agitators, they were deeply invested in the development of civic institutions and the articulation of principles that justified resistance. Men such as Samuel Adams in Massachusetts, Patrick Henry in Virginia, and John Dickinson in Pennsylvania worked tirelessly to translate widespread discontent into organized action. They wrote pamphlets, gave speeches, and mobilized networks of citizens to ensure that protests were coordinated and effective. This leadership played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. Ordinary colonists needed both information and inspiration. They needed to understand why British policies were unjust and why resistance was necessary. Leaders framed grievances in ways that resonated with everyday experience, connecting abstract political theory to the tangible challenges of life in the colonies. By linking taxation, trade restrictions, and military presence to the principles of liberty, equality, and self government, they created a shared understanding that helped unify people across diverse regions. Colonial militias reflected this broader social and political transformation. These local forces were composed of men drawn from all walks of life: farmers, tradesmen, and laborers. They trained together, shared responsibility for community defense, and learned to act collectively. This process built confidence and a sense of agency. Ordinary people began to see themselves as capable not only of defending their communities, but of participating in broader political decisions. The militias were therefore both a practical military preparation and a symbol of self-determination. The Revolutionary period also saw a dramatic increase in intercolonial cooperation. Committees of correspondence linked towns and colonies, allowing information to flow quickly. This created a sense of common purpose that transcended regional differences. New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South began to view themselves as part of a shared political and cultural project. When Britain took harsh measures against Massachusetts, other colonies responded with material aid, political support, and public solidarity. This unity strengthened the belief that collective action could succeed where isolated resistance might fail. The economy remained a central concern. British attempts to enforce trade regulations, restrict exports, and impose taxes disrupted both local and international commerce. Merchants faced restrictions on shipping and trade, farmers struggled to sell crops, and artisans found imported materials more expensive. These disruptions were not abstract grievances, they affected families directly. Economic hardship reinforced the belief that Britain was indifferent to colonial well being and strengthened the desire for self government. At the same time, ideological shifts were taking place. Enlightenment ideas about natural rights, consent of the governed, and the proper role of government had deeply influenced colonial thought. Writers and thinkers emphasized that liberty was inherent, not granted, and that people had the right to resist governments that failed to protect those rights. This ideological framework gave moral legitimacy to resistance and made the idea of independence conceivable. Resistance was no longer merely a reaction to taxation or regulation. It was a principled stand in defense of human rights. Religion continued to influence the political climate. Many colonial churches, particularly in New England, framed the struggle against Britain in moral terms. Ministers warned that tyranny threatened not only political freedom, but the moral and spiritual well-being of communities. Sermons linked civic duty to divine responsibility, creating a moral imperative for resistance. This combination of religious, political, and philosophical arguments helped sustain broad-based support for the revolutionary cause. Fear, hope, and determination coexisted in these years. Colonists feared the loss of liberty, property, and self-government. At the same time, they hoped for a future in which they could govern themselves, control their economic destiny, and preserve their rights for future generations. These powerful emotions drove both action and unity, preparing the colonies for the eventual declaration of independence. The events of 1774 and 1775, ranging from the formation of the First Continental Congress to the confrontations at Lexington and Concord, demonstrated that the colonies were ready to act collectively. They were no longer isolated communities with separate grievances. They had built networks, trained militias, and developed a shared political vision. By the time armed conflict began, the revolution was already underway in thought, organization, and expectation. The deeper causes of the revolution revealed that it was not an accident of history. It was the result of long-term social, economic, political, and cultural developments. By understanding these forces, we see that the revolution was as much about identity, community, and ideology as it was about taxes, troops, or laws. It was the culmination of decades of preparation, debate, and collective experience, which made the eventual struggle for independence almost inevitable.